Hey, I really enjoy doing these things, especially in these times. Having the technology to do programs like this online is great. So it's wonderful to see all these people logged in. But today we're going to do a real basic, brief lawn care and weed management talk. And I say basic and brief because we could do a whole 4-hour talk about this. So we're going to hit some very common weeds and some very common management practices and how to get a better lawn and without a whole lot of inputs. But it's really about managing some expectations too. So the presentation topics, basically we're going to talk about what is a weed and managing your expectations. That's really combined there. And we're going to look at some quick ID weed, 3 different categories of weeds and so some quick IDs of some very common ones. And then typical lawn weeds, IDs, the key you see. And then we're going to talk about healthy grass best practices, including control strategies. And then we'll have a little bit of time after we stop the recording, I believe, for resources and questions. So that's the plan today, and we'll try to keep it fairly brief and save plenty of time for questions. So everybody's heard the definition of a weed. You know, it's a plant not valued where it's growing, and it's usually a lot of times out competing our intended crop, and in this case it'd be turf. And on a side note, we're going to be talking about fescue lawns today for the most part, okay? So there may be some of you out there that have Bermuda or Zoysia, totally different grasses we manage differently, but we still have the same weed problems. So we're kind of talking about weeds in our turf, but a lot of our best management practices are geared toward fescue or cool season grass, okay? And of course, the other definition is marijuana, which we won't be hitting on today. So we'll keep clear of that. So when we talk about managing expectations, everybody's got a different expectation for their lawn. So you see, I've kind of outlined here on the right of the screen, 1 to 10 type of expectations, with 10 being Augusta National, which is the best managed turf I know of in the nation, but they have unlimited budget, unlimited resources to do whatever they need to keep that turf looking perfect. So you need to be looking at this as you listen through this presentation and determine where you are. Are you Augusta National, or are you a well-manicured, irrigated, weed-free lawn, about a 7? Or are you more like my mother on about a 2 or a 3? Very little effort in lawn care. We really don't put down any weed control, or even a 1, which is whatever grows, grows. So you need to figure out where you're at on that scale, and that will help you determine how many times you fertilize a year, whether you overseed, whether you do any weed treatment at all, or whether you do 2 or 3 applications a year, very possibly, to control the weeds. So all of this is relative and subjective to your level, okay? And everybody's a little different. So I want to start out with, really, you have to understand there are 3 major weed categories: broadleaf weeds, grassy weeds, and sedges, okay? And how we treat these weeds is really totally different. And we'll go into explaining that here in a second, but realize that's the 3 major categories. So real quick, in broadleaf weeds, we have 3 major categories within those. And it's important to understand when these weeds come up, when they're a problem, and when they aren't a problem. So right now on the first slide here, we have broadleaf weeds, winter annuals. And here are some 3 very common weeds I selected that are growing vigorously right now: henbit, chickweed, and corn speedwell. Henbit, the top picture on the left, most of us have probably seen, and it's got the little purple flowers up top. It's confused with purple dead nettle, but they're very similar, and it grows fairly quickly. And it's got a square stem. That's a characteristic, and it's in the mint family. Chickweed is a little lower growing and a little mat forming almost, but it does get 2 or 3 inches tall a lot of times. A lot of times has little white flowers on it, and it will crowd out and outcompete fescue pretty easily, sometimes in the spring, if you have a weak turf. So that's another very common weed. And then corn speedwell that kind of resembles chickweed a little bit, but it germinates from seed in the fall, member of the plantain family. Another small blue flower. But those are three really common winter annuals, okay? So they are loving life right now with cool weather and plenty of moisture and all that. Now we have our summer annuals that are pretty common in a lot of lawns. Prostate knotweed, yellow wood sorrel, spotted spurge, and all of these weeds are still in the broadleaf weed category. They have broad leaves on them. They're not similar to grass, okay? So they all can be definitely problems, and we'll talk about controlling broadleaf weeds in general a little later, but they really get going good about now, and you're going to see them mature in the summer as the soil temperature warms up and so forth. But here in the next 3 or 4 weeks is really when we ought to be looking at control, because anytime we talk about weed control in lawns, if we get them when they're small, they're much easier to control. A lot of these weeds turn into more woody stems and much more resistant to herbicides or what have you. So early is always better. Then we get into some really common weeds. As you see the dandelions up top, dandelions and plantains and wild violets are our perennials. And you know, they last 2 years or more, and very active in the summer and very vigorous in the summer. And really what makes these pretty bad is if they're really liking the heat and don't need a lot of moisture to survive, our fescue is struggling in the middle of July and August. So these weeds outcompete it fairly easy. And that's what really makes them a bigger problem. Now, when we go to grassy weeds, there basically are 2 main grassy weeds that we worry about in Kentucky and we try to prevent, crabgrass and goosegrass. And there's a couple of okay pictures to show you what they look like. But crabgrass will take over. It loves moisture. It loves hot weather. And if you mow your grass too low, lower than fescue likes it, crabgrass can be a significant problem. Goosegrass is the same thing, and they're very difficult to control after they come up. So we're going to talk about that here in a little bit too. How do we prevent those? Sedges is the last category, and really we have a couple of major sedge grass that like our Kentucky lawns and like invading our fescue, and everybody's probably seen these. They're lighter green. They tend to grow like 10 times faster than the turf. So you know, you see it a lot more. You mow it and you don't notice it for a day or so, but within a day or two, it's up 2 or 3 inches taller than the grass. It loves moisture, and it's very, very easy to control with the herbicide. I say very easy. It takes a couple of sprays sometimes. But what's really interesting about these sedges, purple nut sedge and yellow nut sedge, is they spread by rhizomes and tubers under the ground. And so when you pull it, a lot of times it pulls really easy, but a lot of times there's little tubers that get left, and that's kind of a defense mechanism for nut sedge that lets it regrow pretty quickly. So pulling sometimes you don't get it all. So when we talk about control for all these weeds, we really want to talk about prevention to begin with. Healthy grass is the best defense for weeds that you can get. So we got to talk about how we prevent these weeds from becoming a problem to begin with. And mowing at the proper height is probably one of the best things you can do. There are several studies out there, and actually UK was doing one here last couple of years about how tall should we mow fescue for the best weed suppression. And so typically 3.5, 4 inches even for fescue will prevent a lot of weeds from ever becoming a problem. And when I say becoming a problem, we go back to your expectations. Are a few dandelions in your lawn okay for you? Where at Augusta National, they will not tolerate dandelions or clover mixed in with their fescue, so they have a much higher threshold. So you have to determine what level of weeds you're comfortable with. And the less weeds you're comfortable with, the more resources it takes to keep those out. So keeping blade sharp is very important. You don't want to weaken your turf grass, your fescue, any more than you have to, or what's naturally weakened during the hot summer and drought and so forth. And cutting with dull blades allows more disease to come in, which weakens your turf. So keep your blades sharp. Don't mow when the grass is wet. Same deal there. It keeps your grass healthier and less disease problems. Change up your mowing patterns. You know, tires on your lawnmower, and when you turn especially, damages the turf somewhat. So when you change up mowing patterns, you're moving that wear pattern around to different places, and you're not hitting the same wear pattern every week. So that will help out quite a bit. Fertilizing at the correct time of year. So I always ask, you know, when do you fertilize your yard? Well, typically what I see in the community is, you know, we go through winter and we kind of rejuvenate, and we always look forward to spring. And so everything's greening up in the spring, and that's when people normally think, hey, let's go out and put a little fertilizer down. Let's get this lawn looking good. And really, we don't need nitrogen on our lawns very little in the spring. Typically, the best time to fertilize fescue is in the fall. And I'm talking October, November, and even December. The grass plant doesn't use that nitrogen so much for top growth that time of year. It builds up resources in the roots with that nitrogen to come out and really get going in the spring. So you don't get the top growth like you do if you fertilize in the spring. So best time to fertilize is, once again, October, November, December for fescue lawns. And that's very important when we talk about weed control. You know, I mentioned the winter annuals that seed themselves and so forth in the fall and winter, and they're really active right now and growing. So if you put down nitrogen fertilizer right now, a lot of it's getting used by the weeds. So that you're feeding a lot of weeds and weed seeds that are coming up. So let's fertilize in the fall, and we'll slow that down. Mow often enough not to remove more than a third of your leaf blade. And that plays into overall health of your turf also. So let's try to remember that. So when we talk about control options, as I said first, we want to treat our grass like it likes to be treated. Treat it good, mow properly and fertilize properly and so forth. But if you're on a 4 or higher on that expectation scale, there are going to be some herbicide treatments you probably need to make. And one of the most important is in the spring, a pre-emergent application. You remember I mentioned that we treat broadleaf weeds and grassy weeds totally different. And the reason is grassy weeds are very similar, physiologically similar to grass plants. That's why we call them grassy weeds. So we don't have really good control options, herbicide options, to knock that crabgrass or goosegrass out of our fescue without hurting our fescue. There are a couple options, but they're expensive, difficult to apply, because you really need some specialized equipment to spray it or apply it evenly. And so it's a lot harder to take them out after they come up. So let's look at pre-emergently keeping those grasses from ever germinating to begin with. And so a pre-emergent application in the spring will prevent most of your crabgrass and goosegrass problems from ever germinating to begin with. So when we talk grassy weeds, a pre-emergent application is the best way to prevent those. Early spring and fertilization and aerification, there's a lot of weeds that thrive in compacted soils. And if you do a little aerifying in the spring on fescue lawns, you'll relieve some of that compaction and hopefully reduce your weed pressures also. Once again, ID is important, because IDing the weed can often lead to what some potential problems are, whether it needs some drainage or whether it's compacted or what have you. So early spring aerification and pre-emergent application will definitely help. In the summer, you know, we've got these broadleaf weeds coming on, the clover and the plantains and the dandelions. Broadleaf weeds typically are applied with post-emergent applications. That means after they come up, we're putting down a herbicide, whether it's a liquid or a granular, like a weed and feed you see at some of the big box stores. Those will take out your dandelions and your henbit and so forth. But remember, ID is still the key. For instance, I'll give you an example. If you've got a lot of henbit right now, and that's your main weed, it may not be worth it to apply a post-emergent herbicide application right now, because as you start mowing here this spring, and as it warms up, that henbit's going to start dying anyway. Okay, so really we ought to look at in the fall, taking care of that henbit when it's little bitty and it's just coming up. That's when we would put a post-emergent application in the fall. So some of our pre-emergents not only control grassy weeds, but they also control some of our broadleaf weeds. So a pre-emergent application, depending on the weeds you have in the fall, maybe you put down a pre-emergent in the spring for grassy weeds, but we might need to do it in the fall too. That'll help prevent some of those from broadleaf weeds from coming up, the winter annuals in particular, in the fall also. So that's an option also, depending on where you're at on that scale of 1 to 10. So in the fall, I mentioned we put down possibly a post-emergent application for those winter annuals, and some of the perennials are still going. We can help prevent those from coming back. If they're regenerating themselves by seed, we'll prevent them from coming back. But also, as I mentioned, a pre-emergent in the fall very well can help too. Overseeding in the fall, and here's what I say to that. We're trying to prevent weeds, and we're doing that first by keeping our grass healthy and thick, and we're trying to get our fescue to crowd out the weeds and not give the weeds a chance to grow. I always make the comment, if you have bare soil, something's going to grow and it's not going to be fescue. Okay, so let's keep our grass thick and mow it at the right height, and we will shade out and crowd out a lot of weed problems to begin with. In Kentucky, with our warm summers and often drought, very often in fescue lawns, you need to reseed or overseed in the fall and thicken that back up. In the winter, there's not much to do except your late fall, early winter fertilization for cool season grasses. So now there's some herbicide options I've listed here. These are some of the most common pre-emergents and broadleaf post-emergents, and one product that's very good on sedges, and halosulfuron, and one brand name. All these are chemical names, in case you're not familiar with chemical versus brand names. But halosulfuron is the chemical name, and it's available under several brand names, such as Sedgehammer is a brand name, and very easy to find at your box stores and your farm supply stores. Pretty easy to apply with a pump sprayer. It takes out sedges pretty easily. Sometimes if you wait until the sedge is fairly mature, it will it may take 2 sprays to get rid of it, but it'll knock it out. When we talk broadleaf post-emergence, those are 4 of the very common active ingredients that we use for broadleaf post-emergence. I do want to add one thing here is a lot of companies out there make a 3-way, and it's got 2,4-D, MCPP, and dicamba in it. That 3-way herbicide has the most broad spectrum weed control you possibly can get. Just about every lawn care company out there uses a 3-way of some type to take care of broadleaf weeds in early summer and even late summer. So that's typically what you're going to find on the shelf. You can spray or apply just 2,4-D, and it does a pretty good job. But the 3-way does a more broad spectrum if you have many different species of weeds. Your pre-emergence over here, quick tip on that is most of the time homeowners are applying this stuff granularly. And if you go to the big box stores now and the farm stores, you're going to find pre-emergent coated onto fertilizer. Okay, so what's important to realize here is we don't want to put a lot of nitrogen on our lawn in the spring, and so you have to be careful buying pre-emergent on fertilizer if it has a lot of nitrogen. So an example would be like, you know, some kind of weed and feed product that's got pendimethalin in it, but it's also got 24% nitrogen. I don't like that product at all in the spring. It's too much nitrogen for your grass, and it'll actually weaken it by the time the hot weather gets here. So try to find one with a very low nitrogen content in it. And it's a little more difficult than I'm making it sound, but search around, do your best to find that. So that'd be my best recommendation with pre-emergence. One other tip I'll give you on pre-emergence is crabgrass and goosegrass germinate based on soil temperature. And a good method of determining when to put our pre-emergent down is when the forsythia blooms. They're yellow flowers early in the spring, between the forsythia and the dogwood. That's the best time to put down your pre-emergent application. Our dogwoods are in bloom right now, so if you haven't put down your pre-emergent, you need to do it ASAP. We have crabgrass just starting to germinate, and after it germinates, pre-emergence will not control it, okay? Then you have to go to a post-emergent product, which, as I mentioned before, takes some decent equipment and to spray, a little bit of knowledge, and it's a little pricey. So hopefully you get your pre-emergent down sooner than later. Just a real quick recap. Keep your grass happy. That's your first defense against weeds. When you're using herbicides to control some of the weeds, granular for homeowners is typically the most convenient and easiest to use. A lot of people don't have a sprayer that will adequately and evenly apply some of these herbicide products. So I would steer most homeowners to granular and use that instead of trying to spray it. If you've got some serious problems and you end up needing to spray, I often recommend to contact the professionals and pay those guys to spray appropriately and get it down good. No matter what herbicide you use, granular or spray or whatever, follow the label. I always tell people, you know, purchase your product, read the label that night and before you use it the next day. Read it completely, know what safety precautions you need to take. And like I said, always use herbicide use as a last option. Make sure we're doing all this other stuff to keep our grass happy before we do that. And don't take on more than you can handle. If you've got a large lawn, a lot of weeds, a lot of different types of weeds, consider hiring a professional to get it back in shape for you. You'll probably be a lot happier by the time it's all done. Here's a couple of quick little websites. Of course, UK Turf website. There's a ton of videos on there to help you with lawn care resources and info. And then Missouri, University of Missouri's got a Weed ID site that I really like, and I've used it quite often. Take a look at that. I visualize pictures help me a lot with Weed ID, and Missouri's got a really nice website there to take a look at. And there's several other Weed ID sites out there that'll help you too, but those are two pretty decent ones. Looks like we're at 1:30. I may have done pretty good on time, Andrea, but don't give up at the end of the summer. Grass is challenging, and realize the biggest thing I really want everybody to realize is as you go up that scale from whatever grows to Augusta National, it is time consuming the higher you go up the scale, and costly. So you need to make sure that you have your expectations correct based on your resources you want to put in. And of course, you can always contact your extension agents in your appropriate counties, and they are more than willing to help you with any questions or weed IDs or treatment options. So that's my presentation. I hope it kind of outlines the basic guidelines for weed control, and love being here today.